Hello and welcome back to Ready Steady DIY. If it's your first time here, thank you for joining us. If you're already a subscriber, thank you for subscribing. So as you can see from this slow and steady creep on the camera, I've really blown it here. I put a little ding in this wall and I gotta fix it. It's not a deep one, but as it turns out, I don't actually have any touch-up paint for this wall. When I found that out, I thought I was totally pooched, but in the end, it was no problem at all. Seems like since the last time I patched a wall, which was like, I don't know, 20 years ago maybe, there have been some advancements in paint technology that makes it way easier to match paint. So in the end, this kind of turned out. If you want to see how I took this ding in this wall from this to this, stay tuned right to the end. I'm excited to show you, so let's get going. Okay, so here are all the things I used to make this happen. As you can see on the right here, there's a sander with some 120 grit sandpaper on it. 120 grit sandpaper is pretty common for drywalling, but more importantly, I'm not just wrapping it around my fingers, I'm using a flat sander, because when you're trying to create a flat wall, if you start with a device that's flat in and of itself, you're gonna do a little bit better. If I just sort of put the sandpaper on my fingers, there's gonna be a slight undulation to it, and in the end, there's a good chance that I'll gouge into the dried spackle and get a variety of undulations that keep it from being flat. So I'm using one of these sort of plastic handheld sanding devices. They've got a little bit of foam on them, so there's a little bit of give, but generally it's flat. It's gonna make my wall flatter than it would if I didn't use it. Of course, there's the drywall knife there. It's a 6-inch knife, pretty standard. There's the spackle in the back there. It really is just a little tub of stuff that goes on pink and dries white. Pretty easy to use, sort of a medium weight. I don't have a lot of stuff to spackle here, so a small container like this is great. And in the back there's a roller. You'll find out why I'm using a roller later in the video. And now the story of how I came to be in this predicament in the first place. So I walked downstairs. I said to the girlfriend, you know, I kind of just had a little thing with the thing and it hit the wall and there's a bit of a ding. And do you have any touch-up paint? She said, sure, go downstairs, check in the basement. There's a can of it right there. I went downstairs to the basement and this is what I found. You may have one of these sitting in your basement too. A can of paint that is very old, very rusted, and did not have its lid put on correctly. So instead of having paint inside, it has something akin to a slightly more colorful cannonball. This is not going to help. I can smear this against the wall all I want. There is no paint coming off of this baby. So now I feel like I'm completely pooched. My previous experiences with trying to match paint have not been good. Back in the day, you didn't have a lot of options. You'd head off to the paint store. You'd get a bunch of paint chips just like these. You'd take them home. You'd hold them up against the wall. You'd be like, I think it's this one, but it could also be this one. And I'm not sure which one to pick, but I think I'll go with this one. And then you'd head back to the paint store and you'd be like, definitely give me this one. This is the one to put in the can. And they'd be like, okay. They'd figure out the number, they'd put the dye in the can, they'd put it through the shaker, and then they'd give it to you. Goodbye. You'd take it home and you would pray. If it was a darker color, the chances are it wouldn't match the paint on the wall. And lighter colors were sort of 50-50. It was pretty tough. Usually you just end up painting like the whole wall or even the whole room for a little ding. Man, but these days it's way easier. I had no idea until I went into the paint store and started asking around. I looked at the brand on the can of paint that had dried up completely that was likely the paint that was on the wall, and a store that represents that brand was in my neighborhood. So I didn't know who painted this wall. I knew it was painted about 8 years ago. When I called the store to see how long they'd been in that location, it was way longer than 8 years. So I'm gonna say this brand, that store, proximity to this house, probably the guys painting this house went to that store. I brought my rusted old cannonball can into the front of the store and I talked to them about it. And they said, hey, if you go back to your wall and cut off a little swatch of the actual paint, we'll be able to put it in this machine. It'll read the little swatch of paint and tell us exactly what color's on the wall. And it'll even include the fading that has happened over the last 8 years. That's why you go to a paint store, I'll tell you. They would have told you that at a big box store too. They have these machines there as well. But the process at the paint store was just way better. So I came home and I cut a little swatch. You want a swatch that's a little bit bigger than you would think. And the reason for that is one, the bigger the swatch, the easier the computer's gonna have scanning it when you shove it in the scanner. But two, you also wanna have a swatch that's big enough so that when they mix the paint, they can test it on the swatch. Like if it's too tiny, it's not really gonna be feasible to paint half of it with the paint you're about to cover up with, and then compare it to the other half. There's just not enough material. But if you've got like a 2x2 piece or a 1x1 piece even, there's a little bit of room there. They can paint a little bit of the paint they make for you on it, hit it with a heat gun, see how it dries, guys and compare. That way you know before you leave the store that the paint's gonna match. It's brilliant. So I cut off my little swatch. I did it in an inconspicuous spot, but not one that was covered by something. I wanted to make sure to include all the UV ray effect that would have happened over the years, the dirt, the whatever. Some people recommend finding like an electrical outlet, removing the cover, taking your sample from down there. But I think, look, I'm gonna put some spackle on this anyway. I'm gonna be fixing stuff and I hopefully will get the right paint. So who cares if I make a 2" by 2" square hole in the paper of the drywall? I'm just gonna spackle over it and paint it. So to me, it doesn't really matter where I took my sample. Dangerous if they blow it at the paint store, but I was trusting them. And I was reasonably confident this was gonna work. So I cut my little swatch. It's tricky. You wanna make sure not to try to peel the swatch off or you'll just damage it. Remember, paint hardens dry. So you gotta sort of treat this like a tile rather than a piece of paper. Even though you're only cutting off the paper level of the drywall behind, you're not cutting into the gypsum part of the drywall, just the paper part on the surface of the drywall. But once you make your square with your X-Acto knife or whatever it is you're using, Olfa knife, whatever, you then want to get your knife back there and just sort of pry it off. The temptation is to sort of get a corner and then start pulling with your thumbs. Don't do it. That square that you have cut is rigid. It's got paint on it. The paint wants to stay flat. If you try to ask it to bend like a piece of paper just tearing off, it will not respond positively. Trust me. So I did a little bit of a clumsy job, but I sort of got this piece and that was enough for them. I took it into the paint store, they scanned it. They gave me sort of 2 color options, one that was exact and one that was sort of a pre-mixed color that would be very easy to come back and order again, but that was just slightly off. I did not choose the latter. I said, give me the exact paint, please. And they did. And they shook it up and then they opened up the can and they painted a little bit of the new paint over my little chip from my wall. And then they hit it with a heat gun and showed it to me. So I could see before I left the store that the new paint and the old paint matched very well. I was really happy. I picked up a few other things. They mentioned something that I thought was really valuable. They said, you know, when you're painting and you're trying to match, it's important to try to use the same tool that the original paint was applied with. And I can look at this wall. I know the company that built it, and for sure they used a roller. There was no, you can look at it and just tell. It's almost certainly a roller. So I bought a little roller in order to apply the paint with the same tool that the original paint was put on with. And then I came home and I went to work. I started out with my 6" knife, just trying to remove any extra debris, any loose paint, or anything else that might come off. You don't want stuff like that underneath your spackle or underneath your paint. It's gonna destabilize the whole thing. Next, I hit it with a little bit of sandpaper, and finally a wipe with a damp cloth just to remove any dust. I took some drywall spackle, the kind that goes on pink and then dries white. You might think, because it's just through the layer of paint, that you can avoid that. You really can't. I showed them a photo of this at the paint store. They told me I definitely couldn't. If I just painted over this, even though it's barely through the first layer of paint, I would end up seeing the shape of this gouge through my new paint. That won't work, so I gotta make it flat. Even something as shallow as this, you gotta make flat with some drywall spackle. I just used a little bit. I smeared it on there good and hard, feathered at the edges, let it dry, and then went to sand. I did a couple passes with a sander. It felt super smooth to the touch. And then I was ready to try the paint. Put a little on the roller it on, and then let it dry. You can speed it up with a heat gun if you want. I wasn't too worried about it. I let it dry on its own, and look at that. Then you gotta go over the little patch that you cut out. Again, make sure to do the spackle correctly, make sure to sand properly. Then I hit that with some paint, and everything was fixed. Wow. This is so much easier than the 90s. As you can see, I'm lighting this from one side only. That's kind of a good trick. Lighting from one side only allows you to see every imperfection and undulation in this wall. In fact, you can see some of the mistakes the original contractors made when they were building the wall. Anyway, so now that I got this system down, they made me buy a whole gallon of paint because of global supply chain problems. They wouldn't mix me a smaller amount. So I've got this extra paint kicking around. I wonder what I could do next. I think the next thing up is this repair my girlfriend did on the wall when the dogs were wrestling and put their hip through it. She did a valiant effort here. It's not a bad job. I'm not saying that, but I think we could do maybe aesthetically a little bit better. So I'm gonna try to repair that next week and use this paint to cover it up. It's perfect. So if you wanna see that, be sure to come back next Saturday and check it out. And if you haven't already, please feel free to like or subscribe and make sure to hit the bell button so you get a notification when I post new content. All those things really help a channel out, especially one like this that's just getting growing. So until next week, take care, stay safe, have fun with your DIY projects, whatever you choose to do, and I'll see you next Saturday.